From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! Could the signing of a historic peace accord in Colombia between the government and FARC rebels bring an end to Latin America's longest armed conflict? First, the agreement must be approved despite right-wing opposition. We'll speak with Professor Mario Murillo, author of Colombia and the United States, War, Unrest, and Destabilization, and with Adriana Benjumea, director of the Bogota-based human rights group, Humanos Colombia. Then we return to the United States to look at debtors' prisons in Arkansas, where a county has been jailing poor people who owe fees for writing bad checks. We'll speak with a woman who once wrote a check for $1.07 for a loaf of bread. The check bounced, her debt ballooned after fees and fines nearly went to $400. And we'll speak with lawyer Kristen Clark. She represents a mother who just spent 35 days in a county jail after she accidentally bounced a $29 check 5 years ago. Then a federal judge has denied a request for life-saving Hep C drugs for imprisoned journalist Mumia Abu-Jamal. But he also found Pennsylvania's protocol for who gets the drug in its prisons is unconstitutional.
Beginning that a federal judge recognizes that what the Commonwealth is doing and has been doing for years is not only unjust, but not right, unconstitutional, a violation of fundamental fairness and the human right to life.
We'll speak with Mumia Abu-Jamal's attorney, Bob Boyle. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Hurricane Hermine has made landfall in Florida, unleashing torrents of rain, storm surges, and up to 80-mile-an-hour winds. As many as 23 million people may be affected by the storm, which is the first hurricane to reach landfall in Florida in more than a decade. More than 70,000 people have lost electricity in Tallahassee. The storm is now headed toward Georgia, although forecasters say it's weakened into a tropical storm. In campaign news, Donald Trump's lost support from members of the Latino community following his hardline, fiery speech in Phoenix Wednesday, in which he promised to deport 2 million people within his first hour in office. Houston attorney Jacob Monti has resigned from Trump's National Hispanic Advisory Council. Alfonso Aguilar, president of the Latino Partnership for Conservative Principles, has withdrawn his endorsement for Trump. Ramiro Pena, a pastor in Texas who's also on Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council, wrote in an email to Republican leaders that the council appears to be a scam and said, quote, "I believe Mr. Trump lost the election tonight," unquote. Meanwhile, Trump is again changing up his campaign team. He's now hired David Bossie, the president of Citizens United, to be his deputy campaign manager. Bossie is a longtime right-wing operative who spent years investigating Hillary and Bill Clinton. The Washington Post is reporting part of Bossie's job will be to craft attack ads against Clinton. Donald Trump's wife, Melania Trump, has sued the Daily Mail Online and a Maryland blog for libel, alleging the two sites falsely claimed she'd been involved with an escort agency. She's being represented by lawyer Charles Harder, who also represented Hulk Hogan in his lawsuit against Gawker, which forced Gawker Media to declare bankruptcy, sell itself to Univision for $135 million, and shut down its flagship website. Hillary Clinton's winning the backing of more members of the military establishment. Retired four-star generals Bob Sennewald and David Maddox issued their first-ever public endorsements, both saying they support Hillary Clinton. Clinton has also embraced the endorsements of General John Allen, who led U.S. force in Afghanistan, and John Negroponte, the former director of national intelligence and former U.S. ambassador to Honduras, while it was staging ground for the U.S.-backed Contras in Nicaragua. In Pakistan, at least 13 people have been killed after a suicide bomb attack on a district court in the northwest city of Mardan. A separate suicide bomb attack also killed at least one person in a Christian neighborhood in the city of Peshawar. No one has claimed responsibility for either attack. In the small African nation of Gabon, more than 1,000 people have been arrested and several have been killed amidst ongoing protest after Gabon's contested election Sunday. The incumbent president, Ali Bongo, has claimed victory, continuing his family's decades-long rule. Protesters have torched the parliament building, while opposition candidate Jean Ping says his headquarters have been bombed. This is one of the protesters.
We are tired of the Bongo family. We've had enough. 50 years, 50 years, 50 years. We are tired, and this is why we're making demands.
In India, more than 100 million workers have gone on strike today to protest what they're calling anti-worker and anti-people policies by Modi's government. Workers blocked railroad tracks and roads across India. Trade unions say as many as 180 million workers may participate in today's strike. This is Brinda Karat of the Communist Party of India.
This strike is taking place when there is an absolute false propaganda that 25 years of neoliberal policies have benefited India. It has accentuated inequality to the extent that today 100 of the families which hold the most wealth in India have more wealth, have more assets than around 2/3 of the rest of the population.
In Colombia, Coca-Cola and more than 50 other companies have been accused of financing terrorism. Colombian courts accused Coca-Cola of hiring assassins from the paramilitary group United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia to murder at least 10 labor leaders between 1990 and 2002. American fruit company Chiquita is also accused of financing the paramilitary organization. Families of the victims have also sued Chiquita in U.S. court. The latest case against Coca-Cola and the 50 other companies will be heard by a transitional justice tribunal. We'll have more on Colombia and the historic signing of a peace deal between the Colombian government and FARC rebels after headlines. Delegations of Veterans for Peace activists have arrived in Okinawa, Japan, to join protests against the construction of U.S. Marine helipads in Takai, as well as the construction of a new U.S. military base in Honoko. Residents of Okinawa have staged massive protests against both the proposed base and the helipads. Okinawa already houses about 26,000 U.S. troops. The Veterans for Peace delegations arrived as a U.S. Marine was arrested in Okinawa for allegedly trying to enter a woman's apartment. Earlier this summer, protests erupted on Okinawa after a former U.S. Marine working as a civilian contractor at a U.S. base was accused of raping and murdering a 20-year-old woman. The victim's father has called for the removal of all U.S. bases on Okinawa. Back in the United States, Florida Hospital and Orlando Regional Medical Center have announced they will not bill the victims of the June 12th Pulse nightclub massacre for their medical care. 49 people died during the attack. Most of the victims were young Latino members of the LGBTQ community. This is one of the survivors, Rodney Sumter.
I was shot in the back, and I had like a hole the size of a baseball that had to be shrunken, and my right arm was reconstructed, and this one's the one that's bothering me the most. Here that we don't even have to pay back the hospital bills as well. You know, that's definitely a relief. I was in there for 16 days, so, you know, it's definitely a big thing for me. They never really told me the estimated amount that it would have been for my hospital bill, but without insurance, I think me being there for 16 days was, pretty crazy.
In Virginia, the Romanian hacker known as Guccifer 2.0 has been sentenced to 52 months in prison. In June, Guccifer claimed responsibility for hacking into the DNC's computer network. He's thought to be the source of the 200,000 DNC emails released by WikiLeaks in July. He was extradited from Romania earlier this spring and has pled guilty to identity theft and unauthorized access of a protected computer. In Indiana, Purvi Patel, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison for what she says was a miscarriage, has been freed. In 2015, Patel was convicted of feticide, becoming the first person in U.S. history sentenced to prison for what the state said was an attempt to end her own pregnancy. Her conviction sparked widespread outrage. In July, her conviction was overturned. She walked free from an Indianapolis prison on Thursday. Meanwhile, Stanford swimmer Brock Turner is slated to leave a Santa Clara jail today after serving only 3 months of a 6-month sentence for sexually assaulting an unconscious woman behind a dumpster. His short sentence has sparked massive outrage against the judge in the case, Judge Aaron Persky. It's also inspired California lawmakers to pass a new law requiring prison time for those convicted of sexually assaulting an unconscious victim. In a widely read letter, Brock Turner's victim wrote, quote, "You took away my worth, my privacy, my energy, my time, my intimacy, my confidence, my own voice, until today," unquote. Georgetown University has announced it will afford preferential admissions treatment to the descendants of Africans enslaved and sold by the university itself. In 1838, Georgetown sold 272 enslaved Africans belonging to prominent Jesuit priests to help secure the future of the Catholic institution. On Thursday, Georgetown's president, John DeGoya, said he'd issue a formal apology for the sale, as well as afford the slaves' descendants the same admissions treatment afforded to children of faculty and alumni. At the ceremony, however, the descendants of the enslaved challenged the Georgetown president, saying Georgetown had excluded them from the process. One of the descendants, Joe Stewart, said, quote, "We are those faces, and our attitude is nothing about us without us. If reconciliation is going to take place as it has to, it needs to start at home, and you don't start by reconciling, by alienating," he said. And more NFL players are joining 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick in refusing to stand for the national anthem. Kaepernick began the protest last week, saying, quote, "I am not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of color," unquote. Well, on Thursday night, 49ers safety Eric Reed joined Kaepernick, who kneeled during the anthem ahead of a preseason game against the San Diego Chargers. That same night, Seahawks cornerback Jeremy Lane also refused to stand during the anthem ahead of a preseason game against the Oakland Raiders. Reed and Lane are both African-American. Kaepernick is biracial, his biological father black and mother white. He was raised by 2 white adoptive parents. Last week, Kaepernick vowed to continue sitting until there's significant change.
I'll continue to sit. I'm going to continue to stand with the people that are being oppressed. To me, this is something that has to change. And when there's significant change, and I feel like that flag represents what it's supposed to represent, and this country is representing people the way that it's supposed to, I'll stand.
According to The Guardian, 723 people across the United States have been killed by police so far this year. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show with the historic peace accord in Colombia between government officials and the FARC rebels. That is the latest step in efforts to end one of the world's longest conflicts. Fighting first began in 1964 and has claimed some 220,000 lives. More than 5 million people are estimated to have been displaced. Early Monday morning, FARC leader Timoleón Jiménez ordered his followers to lay down their arms.
In my position as commander of the FARC-EP, I order all of our leaders, all of our units, every and each one of our combatants, to cease fire and hostilities in a definitive manner against the Colombian state from midnight tonight.
Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos applauded the deal, saying it heralds a new and brighter chapter in the country's turbulent history.
Sino que esta mañana, a las 0 horas,
this morning at midnight, the bilateral and definitive ceasefire started in this war with the FARC. Today, hours later, we are inaugurating the inclusive, most important and complete center of rehabilitation in all of Latin America. It is a joyful coincidence because it shows the closing of a chapter and the opening of another very different one than the one all Colombians have experienced and suffered for the last 50 years.
Well, the ceasefire that would bring an end to Latin America's longest armed conflict must now be approved in a referendum in Colombia, where it's likely to face staunch opposition from right-wing sectors led by the former Colombian president, Álvaro Uribe. For more, we're joined by two guests. Mario Murillo is a longtime Colombian activist, professor of communications at Hofstra University, author of Colombia and the United States, War, Unrest, and Destabilization. Also with us today, Adriana Benjumea, the director of Humanas Colombia, a Bogota-based NGO that promotes human rights and, in particular, women's rights. She's a feminist lawyer specializing in international humanitarian law. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Mario, let's begin with you. Your response to this historic deal that was reached in Havana, Cuba.
No question, it's a major event, and most Colombians are welcoming it, and it's a major historical development that everybody should be applauding. But we have to be clear that to call it a peace process, a peace agreement is one thing with the FARC and the government, but there's a long way to go before we see a real development of a strong and lasting peace. This is the end of a military conflict between one armed group, the FARC, one of the largest, obviously perhaps the largest military guerrilla organization in Latin America, with a government. But there's plenty of evidence that this ongoing armed violence is going to continue until a lot of issues are resolved in the countryside.
And Mario, we mentioned that this is the longest-running conflict possibly in the world, but it goes back even further because really this particular guerrilla war started in '64, but that was preceded by 10 years of civil war that's known as La Violencia, dating back to 1948, isn't it?
Right. So we could talk about the roots of the internal conflict going back to the early part of the 20th century, but certainly the violence in the countryside and the FARC rebels emerging as a result of the lack of addressing the many issues in the countryside, rural development, security issues, infrastructure, human rights, all those issues that the FARC laid out in the 1960s, they go back, decades earlier. And they'll continue to be issues even as the FARC laid down their weapons and hopefully in the next 6 months or so. So absolutely, it's a long historical conflict that's hopefully beginning to make some changes are going to begin to happen that will be very favorable to the long-term construction of peace in the country. And
explain how this works now, because it's not done. There has to be a plebiscite.
Right? This is where it gets complicated. Again, it's great news for Colombia. I want to be clear on that. Right now, okay, so the agreement was publicly disclosed, or finally the full agreement was put out publicly last week by Santos and the rebels. So the peace agreement is now official. The ceasefire is in effect. We've seen basically a real decrease in violence in the countryside between the two bands, between the army and the FARC over the last 18 months. So there is a level of tranquility there. The FARC in the next week or so, next couple of weeks, will be meeting in their 10th and what they're calling their final Congress. And so the leadership of the FARC and the rank and file have to approve the peace deal. Most likely, they're going to approve it. The FARC leadership has pretty much collectively have said that they're committed to peace. The issue of demobilized combatants is another issue which we can get into later, which complicates some of the issues because a lot of FARC rank and file on the ground, they're not necessarily content with the agreement itself and what's going to happen with them in terms of the future, the guarantees, etc. Once the FARC, as the FARC are agreeing to the accord, the Congress has to take up a number of issues, particularly the issues of justice and transitional justice. And as those go through, the legislation has to be passed regarding who is going to be able to receive the so-called amnesty, right? So and that's where a lot of the criticism is coming in about the peace accord. Is this an impunity for years of violence and so-called terrorism? But it looks like the combatants who are not involved in crimes against humanity, the combatants will get amnesty and become part of the political life. There's still uncertainty as to what will happen to those who are implicated in massacres and crimes against humanity on the ground, an issue that human rights groups are concerned about. And they raise similar issues vis-a-vis the paramilitary groups that demobilized back in 2006 and 2007. And then there's the question of narco-trafficking. Is that issue considered a political crime because narco-trafficking played such an essential role in funding the armed insurgency, or is that going to be something else? Is that considered a crime that can't be amnestied, right? So those issues have to be resolved in the Congress. Meanwhile, on October 2nd, that's what was announced last week, the country will go to vote in a so-called plebiscite referendum, yes or no. And it's a very complicated, kind of simplistic question. Do you support peace? The Colombian commentators are saying, you know, we're the only country in the world that we have to ask whether or not we want to live in peace or not. And so that's supposed to happen on October 2nd. Now.
Well, I'd like to bring in Adriana Benjumea. You've been a long time human rights attorney in Colombia. Your reaction to the accord and also to the issue of the punishment of those who did commit human rights crimes during the war.
Bueno, en Colombia, hombres y mujeres, estamos muy felices por el acuerdo de paz entre el gobierno
us men and women are very happy about the peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas. This is a very important progress for justice for women would be to see to it that sexual violence committed by the actors in the armed conflict not be subject to amnesty or pardon. All of the armed actors who have participated in the armed conflict in Colombia have committed sexual crimes. And this should not be part of the amnesty or the pardon. This would represent major progress for the human rights of women, and this is why us women and why women are pleased with the peace agreement in Colombia, and we have great hopes that on October 2nd we will vote yes, and we'll say yes in the plebiscite for peace.
To judge those who did commit sexual crimes or other major human rights violations?
Se ha creado una justicia especial.
A special justice system has been established with various courts. There is an initial moment when those who have committed crimes, members of the military forces, government forces, and the guerrillas, have to confess everything that they've done. If they confess, they have a community-based social punishment. They would not go to prison. There's a second moment where if they confess late, not initially, because there's evidence, then they will face a somewhat harsher, tougher penalty. They could be imprisoned for 5 to 8 years. And those who do not confess will face trial, and the penalty can be up to 20 years in prison.
What are the major challenges you see for survivors of sexual violence in Colombia today?
Hay retos muy importantes.
There are very major challenges for everything that is written down to be actually carried out. For a crime such as sexual violence, it's very difficult for women to testify about this and girls to testify about it, so there's complications for it to be judged and for the Colombian government to have the ears to hear the victims and to make a commitment to see to it that sexual violence not be something that is tolerated in time of war or in peacetime.
And what has been the impact on the society in Colombia for a war that has lasted so long, the impact on the day-to-day life of ordinary Colombians?
En Colombia hay mucha esperanza.
In Colombia, there is great hope.
Los lugares más pobres, los pueblos más pobres que ven las balas y que viven la vida
communities that have seen the bullets fly and who have experienced the violence in the midst of the war, they hold out great hope, but there's also a lot of fear because the right wing is moving forward very forcefully, and there's also a risk of the Colombian people saying no to peace. That would be a very sad day for Colombia. But right now, with great joy, there are announcements in the press about the importance of voting yes for peace, and we certainly hope that our children can wake up one day with a country that has signed an end to the armed conflict and that is headed down the road to build peace.
The right-wing militias that were so infamous throughout much of the Civil War, many of them demobilized a few years back. What's been the result of that in terms of the death squads and the counter-violence against guerrillas and the supporters of the guerrilla movement?
Yeah, it's an interesting, convenient reality that the opposition to the yes vote, the people who are against this peace process, personified by Álvaro Uribe, the former president, current senator, conveniently kind of pushed to the side, because when they're talking about negotiating and signing an accord with the FARC guerrillas and describing them as terrorists who've carried out this long history of violence against the civilian population in the countryside, and that you can't negotiate with terrorists, these communist terrorists, narco-traffickers. That's exactly what he did in 2006, 2007 as president, against notwithstanding a lot of opposition to that, precisely because of the links between the government forces and paramilitaries. It was sort of like negotiating with themselves to demobilize. In the process of demobilization, so the AUC, the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, as an organization, no longer exists. But many of the fighters,
that was the main right-wing.
That was the paramilitary
network.
kind of infrastructure that, in many ways, modeled the FARC structures that they had in the countryside, creating fronts all around the country. And what happened was a lot of those groups still maintain their arms and are continuing to carry out acts of violence, aggression, pressure in local communities. What we're seeing today, for example, and this is something that's not being discussed at all, is the attacks against human rights organizations, social organizations, the social movement, the peasant, Afro-Colombian, indigenous organizations that are supporting the peace process. They want the guns to silence between the FARC and the government, but they have very serious reservations about how that's going to happen, how it's going to impact them. And a lot of these leaders who are carrying out actions, who are denouncing the aggressions of the right in their territories, they're being knocked off. There was a report that said in the first semester, the first half of 2016, 36 human rights social justice organizers around the country have already been killed, arbitrarily detained. Some of them disappeared. And the report, there was something that was recently published in Pueblos en Camino, which is a wonderful website that really focuses on the social movements in Colombia. Up to 78% of those are either carried out by the remnants of the paramilitary groups or the security forces themselves.
What about the 3 environmental activists who were organizing against illegal mining who were assassinated in Cauca, the southwestern province, just this week? One of them, the founder of the campesino organization, CIMA.
Well, therein lies the primary contradiction, right? Because on the one hand, the peace accords have a very progressive, very optimistic and lofty, ambitious goals for the countryside to address the many, many decades, as we pointed out earlier, in terms of economic development, in terms of autonomy of communities, territorial rights, etc., infrastructure. But on the other hand, this government is completely cozy with multinational agribusiness, with mining, extractive mining industry, and in fact, these protests and the opposition to that, they've been focusing on how this government has been aggressively ceding mining contracts, mining licenses around territories that are supposedly protected constitutionally because they're on indigenous or Afro-Colombian territories that are protected in the Constitution. So these activists and many others who have been protesting that and trying to draw attention to that contradiction in this process are getting bumped off by security forces and by dark forces that are remnants of the paramilitary groups.
So in essence, the left, the guerrillas here are disarming, but the right paramilitary groups, the remnants of them are still armed and still terrorizing the population.
Yeah, but I was in Cauca. I was just recently there. I spent three or four weeks in Colombia just about a month ago. I got back about 3 weeks ago, and I wasn't there doing work. I was doing, it was a more personal trip, but I was visiting friends that I've worked with for a long time in the indigenous movement in southern Colombia, and they're telling me how, yes, they as was pointed out by Adriana, they totally support the demobilization of the FARC. But they're also pointing out that not all the FARC rebels, we're talking about young, peasant, very poor, many indigenous who have no options. They have no, possibilities. And for them to surrender their weapons is not necessarily in their interest. And so they were talking to me about how some of those fighters are either putting on a different armband, the ELN, the other armed insurgency that's still, and they're not right now in a peace deal with the government. Some of them are going to continue and participate in what they call bandas criminales, these criminal bands and kind of common criminality that still wield a lot of influence in some of these territories. So there's that concern. What happens to these FARC when they demobilize? That does not mean that we shouldn't strive for that. And in fact, the indigenous movement is really pushing for that, as all the social justice movements. As Adriana pointed out, I think the primary opposition, very powerful, major influence in the Colombian media, is led by Álvaro Uribe, who is in many ways kind of a demigod for the right in Colombia, and they're primarily the upper middle classes. You see a lot of videos on social movements of women in their Prada shirts and their pearls speaking out of their high-rise apartments in Bogota, talking about how we can't surrender this country to communism, how we cannot, we're going to turn into the next Venezuela, the next Cuba, and that we should vote no for this referendum. But the people in the countryside, for the majority of the people in the countryside and a large cross-section of the Colombian urban population, supports the agreement with the FARC.
Adriana, I wanted to ask you, in terms of this, as part of the accords, the rebels who disarm will each be paid by the government about $200 a month, I think, in terms of maintenance of themselves, and be allowed to form a political party. Do you expect that the FARC political party will become a major force in Colombian society, or will it just be sort of a marginal organization?
Pues yo espero que el partido político que conforma
I expect that the political party formed by those who leave the guerrilla struggle will be a major party, that we can all build democracy in Colombia together, that the debate is no longer going to be waged with weapons, but rather within the bounds of politics. And I think that many women and men who leave the war are going to have options in different political parties, and in the elections, in local elections and elections in the largest cities. I think if it were just a marginal party, it would be very tough for democracy in Colombia. I think it's important that all society understand that we build democracy without weapons, politically, with political parties.
The role of women in the peace talks?
¿Cuál ha sido el papel de la mujer en las conversaciones de paz?
Esa pregunta es muy importante para las mujeres en Colombia.
A very important question for women in Colombia. Initially, well, it's been a 4-year peace process. In the first 2 years, there were no women at the negotiating table. It was only in the third year that a subcommittee on gender issues was established, and last year, women's organizations and expert women, many of us were invited to Havana to speak with the FARC and the national government to talk, for example, about issues of sexual violence and women and girls who have been victims of sexual violence. And we can say that the negotiating table in Havana, the two parties, did pay attention and incorporated our concerns into the peace agreement that's been presented to the country. So initially, women were not involved in the peace process. It didn't take stock of the issues of women. It didn't take stock of the quality of women we have in the country. But we in the women's movement and human rights movement have worked to see to it that our proposals as women be incorporated, particularly relating to land issues and justice issues.
Well, we want to thank you both very much for being with us. And Mario, before we go, our condolences, because it's the first time we're seeing you on the show, on the death of your wife, Maria Victoria Maldonado, a wonderful Colombian rights activist and artist, a loss to everyone.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Amy and Juan.
Mario Murillo, Colombian activist and Hofstra University professor, and Adriana Benjumea, a feminist lawyer and director of Humanas Colombia, a Bogota-based NGO that promotes human rights, in particular women's rights. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, a woman tells the story of bouncing a $7 check for a loaf of bread and how that ballooned into hundreds of dollars and her in jail. And she is not alone. Are we running debtors' prisons in this country? Stay with us.
Amigos del pueblo que me conocieron siendo parrandero, a hacerles saber yo quiero el por qué no he vuelto a parrandear. Me fui a la Sierra Nevada porque he decidido hacerme guerrillero, y estoy con mis compañeros en el 19 frente de las FARC. He tomado este camino porque considero justo y necesario que los pobres de Colombia seamos quienes estemos en el poder. Hombre, porque ya está bueno tanta explotación contra los proletarios, y la lucha por ser libres es para nosotros sagrado deber. Y por eso guerrillero soy guerrillero, empuño el fusil y al combatir lo hago hasta vencer o hasta morir.
Cristian Conrado, a musician with and member of the FARC. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Arkansas to look at the case of a mother who just spent 35 days in a county jail after she accidentally bounced a $29 check 5 years ago. Nikki Petrie was sentenced to jail just last month by a judge accused of running a debtor's prison. Petrie had already been arrested at least 7 times over the bounced check and paid at least $600 in court fines, more than 20 times the original debt. Petrie said, quote, "Every time I go to jail, they let me out immediately for $100. They turn around and add $600 or $700 more to my bond. I couldn't afford to pay. They cornered me, and there was no way out from underneath it. I felt overwhelmed and hopeless," she said.
Nikki Petrie's release comes as the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the ACLU, and the international law firm Morrison & Foerster have filed a class-action civil rights lawsuit challenging the modern-day debtor's prison in Sherwood, Arkansas. The lawsuit was filed in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Arkansas against the city of Sherwood, Arkansas, Pulaski County, Arkansas, and Judge Milas Hale. Petrie is one of 4 named plaintiffs in the suit who allege their constitutional rights were violated by the hot check division of the Sherwood District Court when they were jailed for their inability to pay court fines and fees. The lawsuit alleges that Sherwood, Pulaski County, engages in a policy and custom of jailing poor people who owe court fines, fees, and costs stemming from misdemeanor bad check convictions. It also says they jail people in violation of a long-standing law that forbids the incarceration of people for their failure to pay debts. For more, we're going to Washington, D.C., to Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, one of the groups that filed this lawsuit. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you explain exactly what happened to Nikki Petrie? She ends up in jail for a $28 and change check that she didn't realize had bounced because her last paycheck hadn't put it in, and she ends up in jail 5 years later?
Yeah, Nikki Petrie is not alone. This is a debtor's court system that's been in place in Sherwood that preys on the backs of poor people. Nikki Petrie is one woman who exemplifies what happens if you're poor in Sherwood. She wrote a check that was returned for insufficient funds about 5 years ago. That check amounted to about $28, and since that time, she's spent more than 25 days in jail and has paid more than $600 in fines to the local court system. That is money that she did not have. She lives below the poverty line. She remains indebted by more than $2,500 to the local court system. And she was jailed at the time that we filed this suit last week, and there are so many people like her in Sherwood. We filed this lawsuit to bring an end to a court system that we believe preys on the backs of poor people.
Well, Kristen Clark, in that lawsuit, you raise the issue of why this is happening. You say that local courts and municipalities throughout Arkansas have used the threat and the reality of incarceration to trap their poorest citizens in a never-ending spiral of repetitive court proceedings and ever-increasing debt. But you say that also that faced with opposition to increased taxes, municipalities have turned to creating a system of debtors' prisons to fuel the demand for increased public revenue. How extensive is this in Arkansas that municipalities are using this as a new revenue source?
It's not only the case in Arkansas, but all over the country we're seeing the resurgence of debtors' prisons. In Sherwood, this is a court that's generated more than $12 million over the course of 5 years by imposing fines and fees over and over again on poor people who wrote checks to local merchants that were returned for insufficient funds. In Ferguson, Missouri, we saw a local court system that was built on this concept of entangling people in the court system for transit, for traffic offenses. That court generated $20 million off the backs of poor people in Ferguson. But we know that these are not isolated practices. What's happened is that in 1983, the Supreme Court made clear that this is unconstitutional, that you can't lock people up merely because they are poor. But what we've seen is the resurgence of debtors' prisons because there hasn't been enough enforcement to put a check on court systems like the one in place in Sherwood. So we filed this lawsuit to bring an end to an era that's been marked by a court system in which one judge presides, Judge Butch Hale, where he's disregarded the due process rights of poor people at every turn. What happens in Sherwood is that people get online outside his courtroom. They are forced to sign a waiver of their right to counsel. Nobody's allowed in that courtroom but the defendants. If you come with a family member, an advocate, or friend, you're not allowed in. There are no tapes or recordings of the proceedings, no transcripts of the proceedings. People appear without counsel by their side. No one explains their rights to them. And every time they stand up before Judge Butch Hale, he imposes fine, fee after fine and fee and court cost on them, subjecting these people to a spiraling cycle of debt.
I mean, it is an astounding story about Nikki Petrie. Didn't she end up owing something like $2,600 on this 28 and change check?
That's exactly right. She remains indebted by more than $2,600. She spent more than 25 days in jail. She's already come out of pocket more than $600, and that's money that she doesn't have because she, like everybody who appears before this court, are poor people. This is a court that preys on the most vulnerable people in Sherwood, and they make a profit off of this.
We're also joined by Janice, who is a native of Little Rock, Arkansas, has been caught up in Sherwood's hot checks department for decades. One check she wrote for $1.07 for a loaf of bread bounced. The debt ballooned after fees and fines to nearly $400. She currently has a warrant in Sherwood's hot checks department and wishes to remain anonymous for fear of arrest. So, Janice, you're in profile. You don't want to be seen. But explain what happened to you.
On several occasions, I have been arrested by Sherwood Police Department for bounced checks, insufficient funds checks. I even been arrested on my job, 2 different jobs, as a matter of fact. One with 2 different hospitals. My checks has total, I would say less than $1,000 worth of checks, and they're little small checks. I was a bad manager. I didn't keep a good register. So therefore, I had bounced checks, somewhere $20. $100 may have been the highest number of checks that I've wrote, but I have had accumulated fees up to thousands of dollars in fees and costs on roughly less than $1,000 worth of checks.
And when you go into before the judge on these cases, what's the process? What happens there?
He just bring you before him, and like they say, you sign a waiver. You go up before the judge, and he assess your fees and court costs and give you a monthly payment amount. Until you have to pay this monthly payment by such date. You have a 10-day grace period. If it's not paid, then there's another failure to pay warrant issued and additional costs and fines assessed to the amount you already have.
Now, part of your struggle is you have MS, is that right, Janice? And you're trying to deal with medical costs as well?
Correct.
And is this Judge Hale that you're going before, who Kristen Clark just described?
Yes, it is.
Are you allowed to bring in a friend, a family member, a lawyer at your side?
Now, if you do retain an attorney can be there, but family members and friends are not allowed in.
So what is your situation right now?
Right now, I have not been there since somewhere around 2008. And I have an active warrant because I could not afford to pay the monthly payment that he had assessed of $200 because I feel as if I have paid, restitution on the checks that I've previously wrote, but these are all accumulated fines and court costs that has been assessed.
And they've come on several occasions to arrest you on your job. I find this hard. This is a civil issue. Why they would be coming to arrest you on your job?
Because that's what they do. Even though they know your address, your home address, they will come out to your job opposed to your home. And this has caused me to lose 2 jobs because of that.
Kristen Clark, what about that? This issue of, normally if somebody writes a check that they don't have funds for, the bank will send them an issue, a charge. But having law enforcement come in and arrest you for this, especially on your job, is this illegal?
This abusive debt collection practice is part of the scheme. The clients that we represent in this case have had the cops show up at their doorstep and insist that they pay money now or they are threatened with arrest. I am heartbroken to hear the story of the woman who just spoke. But again, we know that these are not isolated cases. This is a systemic pattern that exists across Sherwood and across Pulaski County. This is a court that has made big business out of preying on the backs of poor people. And they have made the focus on the most marginalized people in this community the focus of this court, people who have written small checks that are returned for insufficient funds. That is the focus of this court. And I can't tell you how many people we've talked to who have stories like the woman who just spoke. We represent a cancer patient in this case. He was hospitalized and receiving chemotherapy. And a few checks bounced for very small amounts. And this man has been jailed and remains indebted in thousands of dollars to a court. Every time someone appears but before Judge Hale, he imposes more court costs, more fines, more fees, and there is no way out for the people who are entrapped in this system.
So where does the lawsuit go from here, Kristen?
Well, we filed a federal class action lawsuit. The woman who just spoke may indeed be somebody who is a member of this class. We will fight. We believe that Sherwood is a poster child, if you will. This is a classic example of a debtor's prison. And we believe we'll be successful at the end of the day in securing relief for the poor people of Sherwood. We believe that when somebody faces criminal charges, that they should have a lawyer by their side. They should have a judge who warns them about their rights and who counsels them about their rights and respects their due process rights. We will fight on, and then we're going to look elsewhere around the country because we know that this is a nationwide problem that we face. All around the country, we've seen the resurgence of debtors' prisons. We've seen the criminalization of poverty. So we are going to fight until we end this practice and bring our courts in line with that 1983 ruling from the Supreme Court that says you cannot lock poor people up merely because of their inability to pay a fine or fee.
Well, I want to thank you, Kristen Clark, with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and Janice, thank you for being with us. Not her real name. She is in shadow, but that's because of what she faces as a poor person who is a victim of Sherwood's Hot Checks Department in Arkansas. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, Mumia Abu-Jamal loses a case to get Hep C treatment in prison. Stay with us.
Black is like the magic's like a spell. My brothers went to heaven, the police going to, yeah, they're going to. Hello, operator, emergency hotline. If I say that I can't breathe, will I become a job? Line up to see the movie, line up to see the act. The officers are scheming to cover up their Ask me no more questions, tell me no more lies. You're serving and protecting, is stealing babies' lives. I'm very black, 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 can't send me back, back, back. You take my brother, brother, brother. I fight back, back, back. I'm very black, black, black. I made a back, back, back. You take my brother, brother, brother. I fight back, back, back.
Everything is everything. A mantra says guillotine. A missionary commission misery into angel wings, and all he want to do is be
Very Black by Jamila Woods. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we end today's show with news that a federal judge has denied a request from former Black Panther and journalist Mumia Abu-Jamal for a life-saving medication that could cure his hepatitis C. Mumia has been in prison in Pennsylvania since he was convicted of killing a police officer in 1981. He always maintained his innocence, and Amnesty International said he didn't receive a fair trial. His death sentence was overturned in 2011 on constitutional grounds, and he is now serving life without parole. Last year, Mumia sued to receive an antiviral treatment for hepatitis C after he was placed in critical condition. An official said he was not sick enough to be eligible. The medication has about a 95% cure rate, but it cost the state about $55,000 for a 12-week course of the drug.
On Wednesday, U.S. District Court Judge Robert Mariani denied a motion for preliminary injunction that would have let him order the treatment without going to trial. The denial was based on a technicality that the lawsuit should have named the state's Hepatitis C Committee for Prisoner Treatment instead of targeting the warden and the prison system's medical chief. Even as the judge denied Mumia Abu-Jamal's motion, he also found that Pennsylvania's Hepatitis C protocol for prisoners fails to meet constitutional standards and could prolong suffering. Pennsylvania treats just about 5 of more than 6,000 prisoners who are infected with hepatitis C. This mirrors untreated epidemics in prisons around the country. Well, PrisonRadio.org spoke to Mumia Abu-Jamal after the judge's ruling. This is what Mumia said.
It's a good beginning that a federal judge recognizes that what the Commonwealth is doing and has been doing for years is not only unjust, but not right, unconstitutional, a violation of fundamental fairness and the human right to life. So it's a beginning, and it's a good beginning, and we want a good ending.
For more, we're joined by Bob Boyle, one of Mumia Abu-Jamal's attorneys in the case, and by Democracy Now! Correspondent Renee Feltz, who also writes for The Guardian, where she covered these developments. Bob, explain, because the judge clearly was angered by what's happening to the prisoners, but ruled on this technicality.
Yeah, the judge ruled that the Pennsylvania protocol for treating hepatitis C is unconstitutional. Essentially, under their policy, an inmate, a human being, has to be on the verge of death. Your blood vessels have to be in danger of bursting inside your chest before you're given this life-saving medication. And the judge found that this is blatantly unconstitutional. He only ruled against us on the ground that we did not name this so-called Hepatitis C Committee, this secret group of people who meet in secret and decide whether someone gets this drug. We did sue the warden, the head of the Pennsylvania Health Department, and we did not even know of the existence of this committee at the time we filed the lawsuit. So it's a technicality that we are going to challenge and fight until Mumia gets this life-saving medication.
But 5,000 prisoners in Pennsylvania have hepatitis C, but only 5 are receiving treatment?
It's probably closer to 6,000, and I think their latest estimate, they've upped it all the way to 30 out of 6,000 who are receiving this treatment. And it's because drug costs not just $55,000, $84,000, $1,000 per pill. So the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections is acting in an unconstitutional manner in this regard, but also it is unconscionable that drug companies, and it's only because we have the horrible health system that we have, can charge this amount of money, which will save, denial of which could cause death.
But hepatitis C, if left untreated, leads to cirrhosis of the liver, which costs even more to treat.
And it's also absolutely and causes death and irreversible damage. And also remember, hepatitis C is a communicable disease. So people come out of prison by either sharing needles or sexual contact, can pass the virus to other people who then have hepatitis C and have to be treated. So it is an extremely short-sighted, and that's really a euphemism. It's really criminal what's going on.
Renee Feltz, put this in a national context.
Well, it's not just Pennsylvania that we're talking about. Almost every state across the country has thousands of inmates in their prisons who have hepatitis C. Many of them don't actually know that they have it because the prisons don't provide testing. There have been class action lawsuits not only in Pennsylvania, in addition to what Mumia and his attorneys have filed, but there's also class action lawsuits in Tennessee, where there's another limited number of prisoners who are able to get the treatment, also in Massachusetts and also in Minnesota. Now, New York here has done a little bit better. They've increased their funding in the recent years by about 350% to provide these life-saving hepatitis C drugs to prisoners, including, interestingly, to Robert Seth Hayes, who is a former Black Panther and considered a political prisoner. He was able to be cured of hep C when he got this treatment here in New York, but he has still many, many other problems with his health. He's elderly, and he's still pushing to be granted parole. He's been denied 10 times.
Well, Renee, what about this issue of the drug companies? Because obviously for prisons at this cost, and with so many inmates suffering from hepatitis C, this is a budget buster for a lot of prison systems.
That's right. Now, the company Gilead makes this drug, and it was investigated by the Senate in 2014. And what they found by looking at the company's own documents is that the cost was not determined by development or the cost of acquiring the drug. It was simply to make money. And they weren't concerned about the access the challenges it would present to access.
And I would add, in Egypt, for example, which isn't subject to U.S. patent laws, it costs about $100 a pill, $10 in India. So it's only in this country where it costs so much.
Well, we're going to leave it there, but of course we'll continue to follow the story. Bob Boyle, attorney for Mumia Abu-Jamal, and Renee Feltz, Democracy Now! Correspondent. And a correction to an earlier headline. The hacker sentenced to 52 months in prison after being extradited from Romania goes by the name Guccifer online, not Guccifer 2.0. Guccifer says he hacked Hillary Clinton's private server at her home in Chappaqua, New York. He pleaded guilty in May to charges including unauthorized access to a protected computer and aggravated identity theft. And that does it for our show. If you want to see the transcript or video or audio podcast of any of our broadcasts, go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Dina Guzder, Sam Alkoff, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Sharina Nadura, Andre Lewis, and Renee Feltz. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, and Paul Huckabee, our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars, Anthony Manzo, and to our camera crew, John Randolph, Karen Krug Meadows, Anna Ozbek, and Matt Ely. Again, our website, democracynow.org. We're on Facebook and Snapchat and everywhere else. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.